Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, bonsoir tout le monde et merci d'être venu encore une fois à notre série de débats, les grands débats canadiens 2015-2016. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third debate in our 2015-2016 series of debates on key issues in Canadian history and politics, the Great Canadian Debates. I'm going to start out by saying many of you have heard of the no-fly list, but many of you ended up on the no-buy list, for which I apologize. And for those of you who don't understand what I'm talking about, because we ran a debate a few weeks ago in Toronto about terrorism, and because we ran a debate here tonight about Syria, the American intelligence community, so misaptly named, cut off our access to PayPal because we were obviously funneling money to terrorists. So I thank every one of you terrorists for joining us tonight. The Honourable Peter Milliken, the man who holds the record for occupying the Speaker's chair in the House of Commons longer than anyone else in the history of Canada, and the man to whom I am turning my back as we speak, will as always bring his superb moderating skills to bear to keep our two fine debaters on topic and on time. And those debaters this evening are none other than David Frum, a distinguished columnist, author, speechwriter, and political thinker whose reputation straddles the Canada-US border, an environmental activist and leader of Canada's Green Party, and MP, and of course, Cape Bretoner, in the House of Commons, Elizabeth May. These two leading figures of the political commentariat in Canada will join battle this evening on the resolution, mass resettlement to Canada is the best thing for the country and the best thing for the Syrian refugees, with Elizabeth May taking the pro and David Frum the con positions respectively. Now, everyone in this audience will know that the Syrian refugee question became an overnight issue in last year's federal election campaign, and the country continues to watch the unfolding of the new government's efforts to bring thousands of those refugees to Canada on an extremely tight timetable. Tonight, we will debate the wisdom and the practicality of that policy. And I'm exceptionally proud, as always, that the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has brought together all the elements of great debate this evening, and that thanks to CPAC, we are able to give even those who cannot be here this evening a chance to participate in another debate about an issue of crucial importance to Canadians. Ideas matter, and we've heard over and over again from Canadians that they're looking to hear important questions debated intelligently and thoroughly in an atmosphere of respect and goodwill. And we strive to make every one of our debates meet that high standard, and I know this evening will be no exception. Our special thanks this evening to those organizations that have helped us to make this event come to pass. CPAC, who will air the debate on Saturday, May 7th at 10 in the morning, and Sunday, May 8th at 5 in the evening. So you can either watch it with your breakfast or your dinner. Our many friends and sponsors of this event, thank you. And now I'd like to turn things over to this evening's moderator, former House Speaker, Peter Milliken.
Thank you very much, Brian, and for that exposure to your back. Much appreciated. I want to say what a pleasure it is to be back for another debate, and I think it's going to be a most interesting evening. I hope that you all get to enjoy the whole thing. I thought I'd start by describing the debate, how it's going to proceed. We will have the debaters lead off on the motion that we're going to be debating, which is mass resettlement to Canada is the best thing for the country and the best thing for Syrian refugees. Each of them will have a 20-minute period for addressing us. There will be then a 5-minute rebuttal from each of them, and then we will have an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions. We'll allow basically 3 questions in 3 minutes. So 1 minute each for the questions. At the end of 3 minutes, each of the debaters will have 3 minutes to respond to the 3 questions that have been put. And then we'll have another 3 3-minute responses, then another 3 questions, and then 3-minute responses. And that will conclude that part of it. Then there will be concluding remarks from each of the debaters, 5 minutes each. So that's the plan for the evening, and I'm here to help enforce time restrictions on all this. So when you're up for questions, if you'd like to do that, remember it is a 1-minute limit, and I hope you'll stick to it. The other thing is that we will have an introduction now of the 2 debaters. David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic and chairman of the Board of Trustees of the UK think tank Policy Exchange. In 2001-2, he served as a speechwriter and special assistant to President George W. Bush. In 2007-8, as senior advisor to the Rudy Giuliani presidential campaigns. Mr. Frum is the author of 8 books, and his memoir of the Bush administration, The Right Man, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Mr. Frum also works as president of a family corporation, Frum Global Assets, which invests in real estate development projects across Canada. Elizabeth May is the leader of the Green Party of Canada and member of Parliament representing the southern Vancouver Island riding of Saanich Gulf Islands. She is the author of 8 books, is a graduate of Dalhousie Law School, and was admitted to the bar in both Nova Scotia and in Ontario. She held the position of Associate General Counsel for the Public Interest Advocacy Centre prior to becoming Senior Policy Advisor to the Federal Minister of the Environment from 1986 until 1988. Elizabeth became Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada in 1989, a position she held until March 2006, when she stepped down to run for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. So I think we have 2 very well qualified debaters who will have interesting thoughts and comments on the motion before us. So, as I said, the motion is as follows. Mass resettlement to Canada is the best thing for the country and the best thing for Syrian refugees. I'd now ask you your views on this. And all those who agree with the motion perhaps could hold up their hands. Okay. Those opposed? Disagreeing. I think that's a smaller number, if I'm reading things right. And are there any who are unsure of their position on this? 1, 2, 10 maybe, or 12. Okay. Well, I'll ask the same question at the conclusion of the debate to see if the debaters have had any influence on your views. So thank you for that, and I'll now call upon our first speaker, Elizabeth May, to deliver her opening remarks. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thanks to Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thanks to Peter Milliken, and it's lovely to finally meet David Frum. I'm ambivalent about the motion that I have to defend, because it's very hard to say that mass resettlement of Syrian refugees is the very best thing for Canada and the very best thing for the refugees. Clearly, the best thing for the refugees would be if they had not become refugees. And that becomes a starting point for me in looking at this resolution and looking at the current situation and asking ourselves as Canadians, do we have any obligation here? I'll take a different kind of perspective to the question of the roots of the Syrian conflict. And it may not surprise you to feel or to agree with me that the West really let the innocents of Syria down. We were at the time of Arab Spring watching uprisings occur, and in spring of 2011, we were rather preoccupied with the mission in Libya. And I think it's really important to link the two. We went into Libya with the emerging notion in international law of the responsibility to protect, that we had an obligation as Western nations to go into Libya to protect Libyan civilians from Muammar Gaddafi. Well, if we had that obligation in Libya, why did we not have it to protect Syrian civilians from Bashar al-Assad? What happened? Why did we go into Libya and not into Syria? Because it's clear in hindsight that from 2011 to now to 2016, the implications of the escalating civil war in Syria have been disastrous. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War. More than 4 million Syrians are now refugees, and more than 6 million Syrians are displaced within Syria. So I think this is where Canada has something of an obligation, of a moral responsibility. We abandoned responsibility to protect and shifted our mission to regime change. We got into Libya with support from the United Nations Security Council that this was a mission of responsibility to protect. And once in Libya, we, with our allies, decided that there was no peaceful solution possible, even though there were peace plans put forward. No peace plan would be accepted by Canada that did not put in government those rebel forces aligned against Muammar Gaddafi. In fact, any solution that left Muammar Gaddafi with any theoretical possibility of remaining in place was unacceptable to Canada, and our Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time recognized the government of Libya as the rebel forces. Well, that's quite a change. And I raised on the floor of the House of Commons at the time that this was potentially a problem because we knew al-Qaeda forces were fighting alongside the rebels who were trying to depose Muammar Gaddafi. And as is often the case, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and our foreign minister at the time said, well, you're right, we may not know who will replace Muammar Gaddafi, but we can be sure of one thing, it can't be as bad as Muammar Gaddafi. Well, now Libya is a failed state. We didn't even know that there was such a possibility as the horrific death cult called ISIS, but our actions in Libya inadvertently created vast tranches of weapons from the warehouses of Tripoli, where Muammar Gaddafi had kept his weapons. They went into the hands of terrorists in other parts of the world. And the other horrible unintended consequence was there was no chance of going to the Security Council of the United Nations and saying the same group of countries now want to do something for the people of Syria to protect them from their government. We had so contaminated responsibility to protect as a doctrine that there was no way that we would convince Russia and China that we had good intentions in getting involved in Syria. So the West largely turned a blind eye as the war in Syria accelerated, as the casualties mounted. At this point, more than 250,000 people dead, and an intense civil war, which is largely, if there was a case to be made that there was initially a pro-democracy movement in Syria, that there were democracy forces working, it quickly degenerated into a Sunni-Shiite conflict, sectarian violence, in which we have a whole lot of very unsavory players. Working with Bashar al-Assad to help keep him in power, we have Hezbollah working to depose Bashar al-Assad, we have the al-Qaeda group al-Nusra, we have ISIS, and there are proxy players all through the piece, including what Saudi Arabia is doing behind the scenes to potentially help ISIS, what China and Russia are doing to prop up Bashar al-Assad. And in the midst of all this, millions of people who are running for their lives. And some of those millions of people have found shelter in inadequate, overflowing refugee camps. So I think we do have an obligation to do something for Syrian refugees, and I do support what our government has been doing in increasing the willingness to take 25,000 refugees initially and more later. And the question of whether this is good for Canada and good for Syrian refugees is what I will take the rest of my time to canvass. It clearly isn't adequate to ask the neighboring countries in the region to take an ever larger number of refugees. Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt are overflowing and under a real burden, with 1 in 5 people in Lebanon being a Syrian refugee, 10% of the population of Jordan being Syrian refugees. It's unacceptable to continue to expect those nations to be able to cope. Meanwhile, the UN High Commission on Refugees has not yet gotten its full quota of budget they've asked from the rest of the world. At the end of 2015, they'd gotten 61% of what they asked for. So it's clearly a crisis. Now, Canada can't take millions of refugees. So clearly the solution for Syrian refugees is not merely to talk about resettlement in Canada, but to talk seriously about how we find a way to end the Syrian conflict. And that will take much larger proxy players. Canada can play a role in pushing for that. Canada can play a role in talking to our allies. We have allies that are directly involved in this. We certainly wouldn't be selling armored jeeps to Saudi Arabia if we didn't consider them an ally. They have a really large role here in terms of ending the conflict in Syria. Russia, similarly, China, these are countries with whom we trade, countries with whom we have strong diplomatic relationships, and to varying degrees we have ties. Ending the conflict in Syria has to be a focus of Canadian foreign policy. But so too does welcoming Syrian refugees to Canada make sense for Canada. So let's look at the economic case, and this is one that's well known to Canadians. Our fertility rates, our replacement rates in our population are such that the Conference Board of Canada, to quote one source, but it's pretty well known to Canadians, to maintain our quality, our standard of living, the Conference Board suggests that we will need to increase immigration to Canada by 2035 to every single year 350,000 people, up from 2014, 260,000 people. So again, it's a matter of economic necessity and preference that Canada should be more welcoming to immigrants. Now, what about Syrian refugees? Do they make good new Canadians? Well, on this I'll say something personal. It's not recent for me to work on the issue of welcoming Syrian refugees to Canada. It isn't something that was just born of seeing the tragic photo of Alan Kurdi on the beach. Ever since I became a member of Parliament, I've had Syrian Canadians coming into my office, my constituency office, asking for help. I've worked to bring Syrian refugees into Canada over the last 5 years, one at a time, begging Jason Kenney to let in Mohammed before his wife Noor gave birth, begging Jason Kenney to let in Arif, whose wife was already living in Canada, begging Chris Alexander, as I said, one refugee at a time. And what I've seen, and of course, this is a personal observation of the welcome received, at least on southern Vancouver Island, where Syrian Canadian families are waiting, where the people that I've participated in helping to bring them to Canada have almost immediately found work, have integrated themselves into community, have become very quickly very loyal to Canada. And this was borne out by a recent survey that was published by Environics, which said that Muslim Canadians, and of course a lot of Syrian refugees aren't Muslim, a number of them are Christians, but Muslim Canadians actually express a stronger affiliation to pride in Canada than Canadians who were born here. Immigrants to Canada who are Muslim are very quickly affiliating themselves with the notion that Canada is a good place to live, and the notion that they love living in Canada and they want to contribute economically. We had a recent study that showed that immigrants to Canada, those who are refugees, were contributing more in taxes very quickly than those who had entered Canada on the $1 million investment program to get new Canadians here, because what that program did, and it has been stopped, but that program tended to encourage people with lots of money to buy property in Canada, thus skewing our housing market, while at the same time not becoming residents of Canada, not earning money here, and therefore paying no taxes at all, relative to new Canadians who, even coming here as refugees with the clothes on their back, within a few years had found work and started paying taxes. So on the economic argument, I mean, the German Minister of Labor has said that for Germany, having Syrian refugees come to Germany is an economic plus. I think for Canadians, we can agree it's an economic plus. So then where are there any negatives? And the negatives, when I hear them raised, really revolve around the fear factor of, are these refugees going to be like the Vietnamese boat people? We all loved the Vietnamese boat people. We had 50,000 Vietnamese boat people. People look back on that era and say, well, that was a good thing to do. But are somehow Syrian refugees different from other categories of refugees that we've had traditionally? And in this, I'd say I think we can say they're not different. They are, in the same way, escaping a war-torn country. They're coming to a place for security and safety for their family. They want to make a success of coming to Canada. And we also know that the UNHCR screening process is not insignificant. It takes a very long time for Syrian refugees to receive clearance to come here. I know. I've gone through the process one person at a time, and then in larger numbers since the change in government and the goal of bringing more Syrian refugees to Canada. They still have to go through extensive screening, and then their names and their biometric information is shared with the CBSA, with Interpol, with CSIS, to clear them against any potential security risk. Now, no system is perfect, but a potential terrorist is, I think, more likely to come to Canada on a visitor's permit or a student program. I mean, we're not going to be able to guarantee that any process is 100% perfect. But the track record on refugees, for instance, in the United States, they've taken 115,000 Iraqi refugees and have not had an incident of tourism on US soil. And out of 115,000 Iraqi refugees, 5 were arrested. And that's, you know, if you're looking at percentages, you've got a program in which you've welcomed people who actually are not threats to the society that welcomes them. I wanted to stress what it's like to help people who've come to this country and who believe in Canada and believe that this is a country where they want to stay. So I wrote to some of the Syrian families I've helped on southern Vancouver Island and said, I'm going to debate somebody who doesn't think it's a good idea to welcome Syrians here. What would you like me to say to the whole crowd? So, and I'm not going to correct the grammar. If anyone can help Syrians, it's to look at how to help us stop the war. Then no Syrian wants to leave their country. To give Syrians their right of living, to give Syrians the right of a choice of living, to give Syrians the chance of living. We must not regret of helping Syrians by bringing them to Canada. Over time, they will stand up and work and bring economy to Canada. This is good for Canada. After all, Syrians are educated people and hard workers. If we do a good job of security, we know who we are bringing, then Canada should not worry. But Canada should be proud of Syrians as decent, humble, loving, caring, educated, hardworking people. Those are the people that I've been greeting on southern Vancouver Island. And that leads me to the last point of why I think it's so very good for Canada that we're welcoming Syrian refugees. It's what it reminds us about ourselves as people. We have privately sponsored refugees, we have government-sponsored refugees. And in my community, I've seen, and I think we've seen it right across Canada, whether organized through churches or synagogues or mosques, through workplaces or community groups, a tremendous willingness to raise a lot of money quickly, to find housing, which is hard to do, to start lining up job opportunities, to find language training, to be prepared to welcome people to this country with strangers working together, forming groups, and welcoming Syrian refugees to Canada. And in this, I think, is the greatest benefit to Canada, to remind us again that we're capable of being a very compassionate country, to let the rest of the world see, and I do think this is a significant and substantial image that will help guard against radicalization, is the image of our Prime Minister helping Syrian refugees at the airport try on winter coats. I think it's that kind of message that says to the rest of the world, Canada is a country willing to say, in the face of fear-mongering by other politicians in other countries, that we want to help those people who need our help, that we can recognize in the suffering of families, and this is Minister McCallum made it very clear, we are welcoming families with children. I might question that. I might say, shouldn't we be helping single gay men in Syria? But the decision was made to help families with children, and that's our priority. This is not, as others have noted, an ISIS demographic. These are people who need our help, and our willingness to respond to that with our whole hearts, opening up our wallets, raising money, and finding everything they need to start a new life in Canada is the thing that makes me absolutely passionately yes to the statement that this is the best thing for Canada, because what it does is while it's helping Syrians, it's also helping us to remember who we really are as a country. We're compassionate, we're not willingly fearful, and those of us who recognize that there are reasons to be careful about security then gave the government the permission to say, don't stick to a campaign promise of 2015 as your deadline. Take the time you need to set up the proper program to give us the assurance that people are being screened as they come to Canada. So with that, I know I'm closing a bit before my full 20 minutes is up, but I wanted to say as clearly as I can that there are reasons of morality, responsibility, because we failed on responsibility to protect for Syrian civilians when they could have stayed within Syria. We have more obligations to work to end the conflict in Syria, but we also have a responsibility, and I think an opportunity to welcome Syrian refugees to Canada, knowing that they will contribute to our society, they will contribute to our economy, but they've also contributed tremendously to our own sense of compassion, caring, and reaffirming what it is to be Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. It's a pleasure to hear your arguments on this subject. Our second speaker, of course, Mr. Frum. Sir, the floor is yours, and look forward to your comments on this subject.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Milliken. Thank you, Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Ms. May. I was really pleased and excited by Ms. May's presentation, because I think she did really an excellent job of indicating and sometimes dealing very explicitly with the complexities and nuances of this very painful, very traumatic human question. Some of you may remember the old Crossfire program. When it was mercifully taken off the air, I wrote a note. I was then doing a lot of work at CNN. I wrote a note to the director of the network that I thought they should replace Crossfire, which was a show in which people repeated talking points at each other, with a program where you would take two people of opposing points of view, give them an issue, and not let them off the set until they had worked out a solution they both agreed with. And I know we have limited time, but the doors are going to be bolted, and that is what we're going to do tonight. Because I think we can do this, actually. And I may be failing the obligations of a debate, but I think we can work out some things that we are all going to be able to agree with. Now, let me say, just as Elizabeth May had some reservations about the case she was supposed to argue, I have some reservations of the case I am here to argue. I think there is an important place for selective and individual asylum, where individuals have a well-founded fear of persecution for things they themselves have done, or statuses they themselves are, whether they are a religious minority like Yazidis, whether they are a sexual minority, gays and lesbians. That kind of person, I think, will need refuge somewhere outside of the region. They will not find shelter in the region. And I think we are seeing also an expulsion from the region of Christian populations in something like an organized pogrom. And they too, I think, are going to need some kind of resettlement. What I'm objecting to here is mass resettlement in the sense of more than some thousands of individual people selected for their individual characteristic. What I'm objecting to is the settlement of very large numbers of people chosen because of their characteristic as victims or participants in some cases, or in any case, people uprooted by a civil war. And to understand why, I think we need to wrap our minds around the scale of this problem and its true root causes. I came with slightly different numbers than Elizabeth May, but they're close enough. The numbers I have are 5 million Syrians, former Syrians outside the country, 7 million internally displaced, and about a couple of million, or nearly so, who have already migrated without permission to Europe. It is an enormous, enormous population. And it's not the end, because Syria is the future for much of the rest of this region. We have seen conflict in Iraq, we have seen conflict in Afghanistan, there is tremendous turmoil in Pakistan. What is the root cause of this? The Middle East, the great Middle East, North Africa, and the greater Muslim world is going through a demographic crisis that is leading to war. The reason there is so much violence in the region is not because of somebody did this in 2011 and somebody mistook or misunderstood some UN doctrine in 2007. Since 1950, the population of the Middle East, North Africa region has quadrupled, gone up by 4 times. This is the largest and fastest rate of increase anywhere on the planet. Most of the rest of the world is reaching now some kind of demographic stability. China and India, their populations are peaking. Populations in North America, Europe, Latin America, everywhere we are reaching a sustainable equilibrium of population and the planet. That is not so true in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is extremely not true in the Middle East. This extraordinary surge of population has bumped up against a failure of the region to make an economic transition. Everywhere else, big population has not been a problem because we have moved to more advanced methods of production. But in the Middle East, to give you an example from Syria, Syria in the year of my birth, 1960, had a GDP per capita higher than that of South Korea. Today, the South Korean GDP per capita is 40 times that of Syria. So economic stagnation, massive population increase in an area of very limited natural resources, especially water. This has led to a population explosion of young men. The median age in Syria before the civil war was 22, and unlike the population grids everywhere else look like well-wrought vases with a bulge in the middle, typically about in the 40s, and that's true whether you're looking at middle-income countries like Mexico, relatively poor countries like China, or the rich countries of the West. In the West, the bulge is a little bit higher. In the poorer countries, it's a little bit lower. In Syria, it is a complete, and the Middle East, North Africa region, it's a complete triangle with the largest groups of population, people under 25. So it is not a surprise that there is violence, and there is going to be, tragically, a lot more of it. And with violence comes displacement. Now, it's hard for us in this room, and especially I think it is hard for Canadians, to think about this in a detached way. As Elizabeth May so rightly said, Canadians are extraordinarily generous and caring people, and they want to believe the best, and they have much, and they want to give it. And that is a completely admirable and laudable sentiment. We also live, not just Canadians, but all of us, in an age of social media and instantaneous availability of images. Images, horrifying and beautiful, shape our thinking in a way that text shaped the thinking of previous generations. And that gives us the possibility to form emotional connections across a planet in a way that could never be done before. But it also has, and I'm sure we're speaking to an older group, I can speak a little candidly about this, and some of our younger friends and relatives, we have seen a difficulty in thinking abstractly and precisely about problems because of the power of images. And the Syrian case is an example. Everything that was true about Syrians was true before that poor boy washed up on the beach. And all the difficulties that were, all the challenges and difficulties, they were all the same before and after. And yet that one image changed dramatically the policy and thinking of countries around the world. And I understand why that's so, but one of the challenges we have as people who have responsibilities to the future is to think about why that should be so. Because this brings us to a third challenge that we face, especially with human populations. Human beings who are suffering, human beings who are in danger. It is difficult, and yet it is necessary to think about trade-offs and costs. Here's a cost that you should bear in mind. The cost of resettling a Syrian in Canada, according to the UN High Commission, is about 12 times the cost of settling a Syrian in the region. So you can settle, for every one person you resettle in Canada or the United States or some other developed countries, you can provide water and materials and housing and shelter and some kind of beginning of employment and training. You can provide 12 to people in the region. Now that would not be such a trade-off if the population were like the Vietnamese boat people, a population of 50,000. We said, we'll just take everybody and bear the cost. But when you're talking about a population in Syria in the double-digit millions, and a population in Iraq of people who are going to be coming, of many more, and of future crises to come, there are 800, according to the French Defense Ministry, right now, there are 800,000 people in Libya who are actively trying to find boats to cross the Mediterranean and come to France. And if they succeed, there will be millions and millions more. This is a vast global migration on a scale unprecedented in the history of the world. And it is not one where it is easy to distinguish between who is a migrant and who is a refugee. That's a distinction that is used, that is very important in law, but it doesn't make a lot of difference in fact. A migrant is somebody who is drawn, a refugee is somebody who is pushed, but all human action is really a combination of both. That when the doors are open, there will be millions and millions and millions of people who seek to come. Canada needs peopling, and Canada's benefited enormously from migration. But human beings are not indistinguishable inputs like ingots of copper. People come with skills, they come with attributes, and we need to recognize what those are if we're to make intelligent decisions. I mentioned the median age of Syrians is 22. Before the war started, the average amount of formal education of Syrians was 6 years. Since the war, that number has gone down dramatically. Schooling has just completely vanished from Syrian life. But even in peacetime, 6 years of formal schooling. About a fifth of Syrians worked as agricultural laborers. Female literacy was significantly lower than male. This, despite the happy talk you sometimes hear from the German Council of Industry, this is not a population that is going to make a ready adjustment to the economy of an advanced country. Der Spiegel, in an article that was published about a month after Angela Merkel made her famous her tweet that opened the doors of Germany to 1.1 million migrants in a matter of months, Der Spiegel described the mood of Germany as the initial euphoria has yielded to a mood of uneasiness verging on panic. And what the Germans are discovering is their Syrian population is close to unemployable in Germany. The median cost to a German employer of a private sector worker is 32 euros an hour, after you include all the benefits, all the costs. There is just no way that those people with 6 years of formal education are going to arrive with anything like the skills and attributes needed to succeed in the German economy, especially because so many of the most important skills to succeed in a modern economy are soft skills that are culturally formed. If you can't take orders from a female supervisor, you are not going to succeed in a Western economy. And the people who are arriving from Middle East or North Africa cannot do that. If you cannot coexist easily with people of a different faith, you're not going to do well in a developed country. And the Syrian refugee camps in Germany are plagued by violence between different groups, with Sunni Muslims attacking Christians. Christians are actually one of the reasons that you'll know about a tenth of the population of Syria is Christian, but only about 2% of the refugee flow is Christian. And the reason for that disparity is because you don't begin the process of becoming a recognized refugee unless you enter yourself into the UN system, which starts with the camps where the Christians won't go because they fear violence from the Sunni Muslim majority. It would be kind of a mistake, it would be a serious mistake to think of what is going on in Syria as a war between two small armed gangs with the vast majority of people innocently and indifferently caught in between them. This is a true civil war between warring populations in which many, many people have had varying degrees of participation, and in which both sides draw considerable support from just about everybody on one side or the other. That's why the war has been so protracted and so horribly violent. It's because a lot of people agree to some degree or another, they may not bear arms themselves, with the ideals of either the Sunni side or the government side, and they bring those views with them. Canada is an amazing place, but it is not a magical place. People do not lose sight of who they are in 10 minutes or 10 months or 10 years. It takes a generation or two to refashion migrants to fit into their new world. Now, we talk a lot about screening, and I think that's an important thing to do. But we must face the fact that in any practical sense, screening is impossible, and in a deeper sense, it's irrelevant. And here's why screening is impossible. People are coming from a war zone. How do you check the identity of somebody from Syria? What database do you use? There is none. And if there were any, would you trust a database provided to you by the Assad government? You know, how do you know whether this person is the person he says he is with the background he says he's got? Who can you check that against? The database process is slow, not because it's exhaustive, because they actually do very little work, as I have debated this with people who've worked in that process. It's slow because of the amount of cases they have to document. But each case gets a very cursory examination, because in the end you can't know. But in any case, this whole matter of screening, it's irrelevant anyway, Because what we have seen with the migration of Middle Eastern populations to Western Europe is the problems show up in the second generation, in the people who are born in the country. The parents arrive, they're nervous, this is a new world, they don't speak the language, they get by as best they can. The children are born in this new country, but this acculturation does not happen so fast. And those of us who have immigrant backgrounds ourselves, as I do, understand migration is extraordinarily difficult and stressful and makes demands on us. And those demands have become only harder as we have moved into a world in which muscle counts for less and these soft skills count for more. So what we are seeing across the continent of Europe, which has already received a huge migration from the Middle East and North Africa, and which will receive more, is an ever-rising level of social disharmony verging on violence. 2015, which is the year of the Great Migration from Syria, was also the year in which anti-Semitic hate crimes reached an unprecedented level in Great Britain. It was the year in which crimes of violence against both Jews and gays reached an unprecedented level in France. It was the year of the mass organized sex attacks in the city of Germany, not just Cologne, but other cities as well. It was the year in which we have seen riots and anti-Semitic incidents in Swedish cities like Malmo. I don't want to be, I look at this not as a way of pointing fingers or saying there are groups of people who are somehow intrinsically bad. People are people. But the journey from a country that is rural, that is not very literate, where skill levels are low, and where you are imbued from the moment you are born with a conviction that women have a certain place, that religious views are privileged, and that violence and success in violence is the test of a man. That the journey from that place to another place is an extraordinary, difficult journey to make, and the half fragments of this that your children are raised with create a situation where Europe is now inheriting, and where Canada will, if you accept this resolution, will find itself also inheriting a degree of social turmoil and violence unheard of since the Second World War. 7,000 Jews have emigrated from France in the past 2 years. As a response to anti-Semitic violence. That the price of the in-migration of these large Middle Eastern communities has been the out-migration of the remnants of the European Jewish community. I've heard senior people in the German government say we have to do this because of our debt to our own history. And I ask them, how do you repay your debt to history by driving into exile Europe's last Jews? Because that is one of the consequences of the gigantic demographic change that we are seeing. There are responses to this tremendous humanitarian crisis that are responsible and that are affordable. You can produce, and this is why I want to direct your attention again to that figure of 12 times the cost to bring people to North America as to take care for them in region. As Elizabeth May so rightly said at the beginning of her remarks, the best solution is for people to return to their homes. Now, there's a political process as to how we make that possible. How do you bring peace to Syria? That is outside the terms of tonight's debate. But on the borders of Syria, and inside, by the way, when we talk about Lebanon and Turkey, it is important to recognize that these are territories that within living memory were one political entity with Syria. Lebanon was part of Syria before the Second World War. Syria was part of Turkey before the First World War. These are not catastrophically traumatic migrations for people to make. It should be possible to bring them running water. It should be possible to bring them electricity. It should be possible to bring work to people where it is needed. It should be possible to bring education in languages that people already know to the places where people already live. It is a big mistake to think of Syrian refugees as living in acres and acres of tents, although we have seen that image. Most of them now live in the cities of Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, and they need help. And ironically, at exactly the same moment, when we are experiencing this giant mass migration from Syria into Europe and, if we don't choose correctly, into North America, at exactly that moment, all of the agencies that provide services in country to many more people than will ever migrate are starved of funds and are reporting constant shortages and are finding that they cannot raise the money, not from the Persian Gulf, but also not from the countries of Europe who are overwhelmed with the social problems they are experiencing as a result of the migration they've already received, never mind the bigger migration that could be in store if we follow this resolution. That the bulk, the vast majority of the Syrian population in area in need is being neglected worse than if we had a responsible, concentrated focus on the problem where it is found and where it must be dealt with. Elizabeth May herself agreed we can't move millions of people. But the problem is denominated in the millions of people. And if you have a problem denominated in millions of people, and you say, well, my solution won't work for millions of people, it's not a good solution. The solution must be proportionate to the problem. Migration to the West, migration to Canada is not a solution proportionate to this problem. And precisely because you are the kind of people whom Elizabeth May so rightly praised as compassionate, people with a vision of the future, but also because you want your compassion to be used in ways that do not just gratify the impulse of the moment, but that actually lead to long-term benefit. You are going to, I hope, agree that the answer to this question is no. The right solution to the Syrian crisis is generous, responsible provision of water, electricity, education, job opportunities in the place where the refugees are and where most of them inevitably must stay. That's my proposal to you tonight. And the doors will be open. You can leave if you want to after the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frum. Ms. May, the floor is yours again for your rebuttal. 5 minutes. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very hard not to say thank you, Mr. Speaker. But I want to try to get to some of the points that David has made, and I think he set up a couple of straw men, no offense. I want to try to cut through some of that and still get through in 5 minutes. Part of it is saying that we're looking at a demographic bulge, and that's the whole problem. Well, clearly violence in the region had a lot to do with things that other governments have done, some with whom you had some close affiliation. So the illegal invasion of Iraq is the proximate cause for a whole lot of things that have gone wrong. And the destabilization of the region is more than the fact that there are a lot of young people there, although that is a factor. So is it a factor that climate change created significant drought in North Africa, particularly in Syria and in Yemen, and is part of the destabilization as people can't grow crops where they were living and moved into cities, and that's always a prescription for difficulty. The relocation of peoples, though, is only an explanation insofar as you can take it. The Civil War had some of its roots, many scholars have written about this, at least partially, in climate change. But Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime and the fact that, yes, there is more than just one group of one gang versus another gang. There are a lot of very unsavory players. And the people I know from Syria who are coming to Canada, and again, not every Syrian refugee wants to come to Canada. People who want to come to Canada actually want to come to Canada because they see us as a society that has developed a fairly miraculous capacity for multiculturalism, for living together, and for recognizing the best in what people bring to us. So contrary to the suggestion that people from Syria are particularly uneducated, the 2011 National Household Survey for Canada, and this is of course of people who are already living here, but Canadians 25 to 54 years old of Syrian origin in comparison to the average Canadian are more likely to have a university degree. In terms of the labor market, 80% are employed, although it is true that Syrian women are less likely to enter the labor market. Only 64% of Syrian women enter the labor market. So the eastern part of Syria is largely poorly educated, and they're a smaller population, but the western part of Syria has people who have become a fairly large professional class. Many of them are the ones who seek to come to Canada because they see they can live here. So what are we to make of the conflation of acts of anti-Semitism with the generalized statement that Syrians were on the move in that period? I've been plowing through all the information I could find in advance of tonight's debate, and I can't find any evidence linking Syrian refugees with particular actions against, and certainly anti-Semitism is intolerable and must be thoroughly rejected, but there's no real evidence from anything that I can find that Syrian refugees are responsible for anti-Semitic acts in France, nor can we find any evidence that as Syrian refugees have come to Canada, there's been any increase in anti-Semitism or violence. In fact, Syrian Canadians who've been here for a very long time, who were born here, have told me that during the election campaign, the kind of intolerance that was typified by the proposed tip line for zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices, that made them feel uncomfortable in their own country, and they were born here. So that's another reason to say, for the limited amount of mass immigration that we're talking about, 25,000 people now, maybe another 10,000 people later, and so on, that is in a context that fits with the size of Canadian society. These are people we can bring here, and they will become part of our society in a way that's positive and productive to our economy. The reason it became such an election issue so fast was that the previous Conservative government had promised to bring in 10,000 refugees themselves. They promised that in January, and then they stopped the migration process, and then we discovered that Alan Kurdi's aunt lived in Vancouver and had wanted to get that little boy here. These issues are complex and interrelated, but we must not conflate generalized violence with the group of people who are looking for homes here. And as for looking for delinquents in the next generation, I remind you of that 11-year-old Afghanistani refugee who's now our Minister for Democratic Reform and Institutions. I think we have success in the second generation as well as in the first, with the right programs, with Canadians participating fully as we have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. May. Mr. Frum, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, sir, for rebuttal.
I agree with Elizabeth May that the problem of anti-Semitic violence in France is not, by the way, 600 violent incidents a year, including in 2015 the massacre at the kosher market, very large-scale violence. This is not graffiti, not chalk marks on it. I agree with her that that is not a work of the people who arrived in the present flow of migration. It's a work of the people who arrived, who are the children of the people who arrived in the Algerian migration of the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in Algeria. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and many of them arrived in France. And their children, who grew up having the difficulty of transition, their children are the people who are committing these crimes, not just against Jews, but also against gays. Again, 2015 was the record year for anti-gay violence in France. In the same way, in Sweden, where we are seeing very high levels of violence against women and against gays, they took on a large Kurdish population in the 1990s, and it is the children of that Kurdish population. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't wonderful people, and that isn't to say that everybody does this thing. In fact, it is always the work of a minority. But understand that this problem of the problem of acculturation is way more difficult than proponents of an easy solution will acknowledge. And when you make the population big enough, if the problem of acculturation affects a fifth of that group, if you're talking about 10,000 people and you've got a fifth of them are people who have trouble with the law, who are delinquency, who take out their anger against women or gays or Jews, police forces can cope with that. As we saw in Brussels right now, that the police force of Belgium simply cannot keep track of all of the suspects they have. The entire Belgian police force is now tracking radicalized suspects in Brussels. Again, these are children of people who arrived in the 1990s, and they're overwhelmed. You make the denominator big enough, and even if the fraction's fairly small, the numerator becomes impossible to cope with. And that is why mass resettlement. Now, if the question is, can Canada take 10,000 carefully screened people, particularly from groups like the Yazidis, from the Christians, from gays and lesbians, I say, if that's what the proposal is, I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. That is not mass resettlement, that is selected resettlement. If we are choosing people who themselves have experienced persecution for things they have done, then that again, that is something that we can well cope with. Mass resettlement is resettlement proportionate to the mass disaster we face. And that, I think we are reaching agreement here. That, I think we both agree, is impossible. And it may be that we're going to be unanimous at the end of this evening, that no one here thinks that mass resettlement of Syrians in the West or in Canada can possibly work. It won't help the Syrians because there are too many, and it will be dangerous for Canada. There's a Yiddish saying, for instance isn't proof. And I am not here, I watched the Monk debate in Toronto that dealt with some of the same issues. And I have to say, I wasn't pleased with it. I don't think that we get anywhere by looking at a population of millions of people and citing one bad actor and comparing him or her to one good actor, because with millions of people, there are a lot. I think you have to think globally. And you have to recognize, and you have to say, will people who may not even start off as bad actors, what happens when you bring them into an environment where they can't succeed? Where you bring them into an environment that challenges their core beliefs about the hierarchy of the sexes, they have a belief about that challenges their core beliefs about the hierarchy of religions, and that asks them that insists they work and requires of them skills they do not have and are not going to develop. Syria is not a country of well-educated people. Remember, it's a country of basically 1/5 of the population, agricultural laborers. Before the Civil War, 6 years of education, and education that is not very relevant to the demands they are going to meet in Canada. This is not going to work. It's not going to be a success. It's not doing anybody a favor, and it is going to cost 12 times as much per person as providing electricity and water and jobs in sight, which is where most of them must remain anyway, and where right now the funds are most desperately short. So I urge you, I don't want to ask you to say no. I want to ask you to say yes to adequately funding through international organizations, adequately funding the resettlement of Syrians where they are, and providing adequate levels of support, material support, job opportunities where they are. That is the thing to say yes to. And the proposition tonight is a terrible distraction. And as Elizabeth May and I think agree, an unworkable distraction from the real solution to the real problem. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the floor is now open to questions. As you see, there are 2 microphones. I'll take 3 questions on this for this session. Then we'll have another 3, and then the plan is another 3. So, should we start here, sir? The floor is
thank
yours.
you.
1 minute, sir. Okay.
I worked as an immigration officer for 35 years, and I agree with Ms. May that the investment program is a betrayal of Canadian interests. The other issue is mass migration. When we selected immigrants, we were bloody lucky to get them. They were a treasure that our people should be grateful they received, because they helped us. They helped all of us. They did great things for our culture and our economy. No doubt about it. The refugee movement, is something else entirely. Now, I hate to raise a difficult issue, but we're talking about ideology. If your ideology, based on 13% the Quran, and the rest, some 85% on Mohammedan Sharia law, I don't think that culture is going to help our country, and if we get masses, we're going to have the results that they have in Europe, UK, Germany, Denmark, Sweden. It's a betrayal of the interests of our grandkids. Thank you.
Thank you. That's more a comment than a question, but we'll hear more. Second question, sir.
We are seeking solutions. One of the solutions we can do quickly, we have to first of all acknowledge that we created these problems in the Middle East by being addicted to the oil of Muslim countries. What we must do first and foremost is to completely put a ban on importing oil into the Western world and boycott any country that actually deals with that oil or imports its oil from the Middle East. The second thing we can do is to persuade the Greeks to lease us maybe 2 or 3 islands at some billions of dollars per year to help them with their debt problem, and house these individuals on these islands until they are ready to go back home. This is, I think, in my opinion, this is the best way to deal with this issue and not to bring them here to Canada. Thank you.
Sir, the third comment.
Thanks. This question is mainly directed at David Frum, that's okay, because you said that you weren't pleased with the monk debate. Well, Mark Stein and Nigel Farage did an absolutely fantastic job in that debate, talking about the stupidity of importing a new rape culture while talking about rape cultures in university campuses. And I'd like to know why you weren't pleased with that debate, and if Elizabeth May's got any comments too, because apparently, according to the format, you're both supposed to comment on both. Anyway.
Okay, Elizabeth, the floor is yours for a 3-minute response to the 3 questions.
Well, I have to say that the last question I'll leave for David, because I didn't watch the Monk debate, so that will leave me aside from that one. I wanted to comment on this idea too, that there is a safe place where we should be, whether it's an island in Greece or how we would cope with this. As far as we know at this point, there isn't a place, as David referred to it, as in sight, where we can keep people housed at a very long time. I met with the Foreign Affairs Minister from Lebanon last spring and said, do you want more money from Canada? Do you want more help to be able to house refugees? And he said, no, it's costing us a tremendous amount now for electricity for the refugee camps. If you give us more money, we'll just be breaking under the weight of a population. What we want is help to end the war in Syria and hope that people can reestablish themselves in Syria. So to the extent that we're agreeing on things, I think it's safe to say that millions and millions of people are not going to be coming to Canada. But this question, I think, does pit the idea that our current plans to be more ambitious, to accept tens of thousands more Syrian refugees than we currently have, and that's how I understand the question, is one on which I think we need to move to the positive and say this is something where we can enhance Canadian economy, enhance Canadian society by welcoming refugees. So I take the point very seriously from our friend who had 35 years experience as an immigration officer. I do think that we've seen great things come of accepting refugees from other countries, accepting immigrants from other countries. So what we need to do in this instance is ensure that our welcome doesn't ghettoize a new population, that we continue on the process that we have in the past, and I think that's clearly a problem in certain parts of Europe where people feel hopeless and separate and isolated from the greater society. Canada has been remarkably good at bringing people into the heart of our culture, into the heart of our society, and finding them work. So yes, it's not one or the other. Yes, we should be funding and helping refugees in the situation in which they find themselves in the region. Yes, we should be bringing more to Canada. Yes, we should be doing much, much more to end the violence that is through the region and which is driving people in droves from their homeland to try to find a safe place to raise their children.
Thank you. From the floor is yours, sir.
Let me start with the last question that was directed to me. I began my remarks by saying I don't think we should make policy on the basis of sad images of a body on the beach. I also don't think we should make policy on the basis of horrifying images of crimes. I think we have to think about this in how it's going to be true for large numbers of people. So although I think it is dangerous, I would agree with the answer that Mark Stein and Nigel Farage had, but the answer is no. I don't agree with the method of pointing to individual shocking incidents as proving anything. Individual incidents, we're talking about populations of millions, don't prove much. Whether they're the sad incidents, and for every horrifying story that Stein and Farage could cite, there was a heartbreaking story that somebody else could cite. And what you end up then is with exactly the kind of thing that I began the evening by saying I think gets in the way, which is you get a battle of dueling emotions and dueling images when we need to think for the future and think for the next generation about how you build this country. This country's interests, I believe, are in saying no. I don't think they got the answer wrong, but I think that they went about it in a way that is just going to be met with more sad images. For every horror story, a sad image. Now let me answer the question about the comment about the oil. No, I do not believe that the West made this problem. The cause of this problem, I am convinced, is the ecological crisis. I think global warming or climate change does have a lot to do with it. But it's not just because of the oil. Egypt, which has no oil, 17 million people at the end of World War II, 40 million people when Anwar Sadat was assassinated, 80 million people when Hosni Mubarak was driven from office, something over 90 million people now, the single largest group of the population under 25, no work for them, no possibility of marriage for them, and the result is ever rising levels of violence which are met with ever heavier levels of repression from the Egyptian state. How long is that going to last before Egypt cracks? And there are millions of Egyptians seeking entry into Europe. I don't know the answer to that question. Those are the kinds of problems that we are confronted with. You've got a region that is in a Malthusian crisis. and it needs a solution. But the mass migration of that population into Europe will only, and into North America, will only impose that same crisis on other countries, not solve that crisis in region. It is going, and it will change the receiving countries. Migration, it is true that we have low population rates of growth in the West, and that's a big problem. But that is what makes immigration more troublesome, not less. I often say that migration is to natural population increase as wine is to food. A good complement, a bad substitute.
Okay. We'll start with our second set of questions. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd just like to start by saying, Mr. Frum, you spoke that, you said that some of the Syrian refugees coming in are uneducated and therefore unfit to be able to find a job and unqualified. I have friends with PhDs that are still unqualified to find a job in Canada, so I feel like that falls a little flat. But I'd like to direct a question at both of you, how this has become such a crisis with 3 to 5 million Syrians, when the UN has said we're staring down the barrel of 250 million climate refugees by 2050. And so I suppose that my question would be, how much more difficult does this debate become when the driver of migration is not a objectively evil death cult, but rather the sum of our reluctance to act on something we should have done a long time ago that's going to cost a lot more than 3 to 5 million refugees?
For our next question, we'll turn to this microphone, sir.
I guess my question would refer to regarding sort of how societies incorporate refugees. Mr. Frum, I know you've spoken quite a bit in the American case about how the costs of absorbing large amounts of immigration are essentially paid by people who are least able to pay it in those societies. Could either of you or both of you sort of come up with a model or an example you can point to of what it would look like for a country to absorb sort of these large migrant populations, where the political elites of those countries would actually pursue some sort of actions or policies that would actually mean that they bore their fair share of the burden?
Thank you. And our third question will be here, sir.
Thank you. First of all, a fact correction. UNHCR's screening of potential refugees has nothing to do with security. The UNHCR, while it could exclude a person if they are found to be terrorists, is very reluctant to do so. The onerousness of their screening is caused by a lack of resources devoted to it because they fundamentally don't really support resettlement. A number of people, including Ms. May, have made a reference to climate change. The science shows that when people migrate from the developing world to the developed world, their carbon footprint increases by about 4 times. Canada's immigration level, which is set every year by the government, is not subject to any environmental studies, including no study on its impact on climate change. Should that become part of the immigration level setting exercise?
Thank you very much. May, the floor is yours for your 3-minute response. Oops,
To move very quickly is first to set aside, if I suggested that UNHCR was doing security clearances, I apologize, they are screening to make sure people meet the definition of refugee. Then the Canadian visa officers do an additional interview, and they're very concerned about security questions, and then that information is also shared with CBSA, Interpol, and CSIS, and so on. So it's why it takes so long to locate, to resettle Syrian refugees. We have a lot of private sponsorship groups that are getting, and I certainly hear from them a lot of the time, a lot in my writing, where we've got houses ready for Syrian refugees, and we're waiting, and we haven't gotten the approval process yet to get them in. It's interesting how many of these questions in this last batch hovered around various aspects of the climate crisis. The fact that if we don't reduce our emissions very, very rapidly, we will see a mass increase in environmental refugees, such as make the current Syrian crisis a drop in the bucket. So the key things are to recognize that we still have time, although not much, to actually make good on our ambitions in Paris to ensure that global average temperature does not go above 1.5 degrees Celsius above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. That's roughly where we need to hold global average temperature if we want to avoid losing all the low-lying island states of the planet and begin to play Russian roulette with whether we get 7 to 8 meter sea level rise if we lose the Greenland ice sheet, and environmental refugees will then swamp countries all around the world and also lead to geopolitical instability, which is why so many military organizations are increasingly concerned about climate change. Climate refugees are not a hypothetical problem. So the solutions add up back to a suggestion of not importing Mideast oil. Well, the transition off oil altogether is the goal that came out of the negotiations in Paris, and that needs to be adopted as quickly as possible. And that gets to the other point made by the last questioner. Yes, it's true. When people leave situations in developing countries, their carbon footprint goes up when they come to Canada or the US or any industrialized country. The goal here is to ensure through climate justice and global equity that we do not continue to live in North America in such a way that we deprive other people of their rights to life and livelihood, and that by transitioning off fossil fuels, which fortunately is now increasingly possible through the plummeting price of solar photovoltaics, through the advent of a lot of very commercial, marketable, renewable energy, through clean technology, we really do have the opportunity to make sure that wherever you live on the planet, you start living within a carbon budget. The state of California has the goal of no more than 2 tons per person in terms of their own carbon footprint. That would equalize them with the countries in the developing world from which refugees are coming.
Those were three very rich and sophisticated questions, and I won't be able to do justice to them. But let me take 2 points that I think it is important to make. The first is to go to this point about screening. It is important for people to understand it simply cannot be done. It doesn't happen. Because what are you using as your database to screen against? How do you know when you're presented with the document from someone who's come from a war zone where the state is shattered, and where the state, to the extent the state functions, the state is an incredibly sinister and totalitarian organization that lies about people all the time. How do you check the document? It can't be checked. And even if you could check it, it would be useless, because the question you want to ask is, Mr. Mrs. Refugee, will the children you have in your new country, will they acculturate successfully to that place, or will they be alienated from it in the way that so many young French, Belgians, British, and Germans are, and will they turn to violence, whether it's terrorism or just ordinary delinquency? Will they attack gays? Will they attack women? Will they attack religious minorities? How do we screen for that? That can't be done. But it is predictable that that is going to happen, and that is the challenge we face. On these questions about climate, again, rich, dense subject, but the thing to say, and I forget now which, I apologize, I forget now whether it was the first or the second questioner who raised this point, and Elizabeth May is right about this. It is important when you are thinking about how to respond to Syria to understand, just as that it's not the first, the Algerian civil war of the 1990s was the first, but this is the next, and the one after that will be bigger, of an increasing tidal wave of chaos from the 2 parts of the world that are not bringing their populations into balance, the Middle East, North Africa region, and the Sub-Saharan Africa region. As we are going, Nigeria is going to overtake the United States in population within the lifetime of the children of people in this room. And that economy is failing, and there's going to be a mass migration out of Nigeria. We are going to see mass migrations from Yemen as that civil war intensifies. It's just because it's so poor that people can't scrape together the resources to pay the human smugglers that we don't have millions of Yemeni refugees, but we will. How is Saudi Arabia going to end up? How is Egypt, as it crosses 100 million people with not enough water and not enough food? Egypt, which at the end of World War II was a major exporter of cotton and today is the largest importer of wheat in the world, and which is seeing a crashing standard of living. As I mentioned, Syria in 1960, higher standard of living than South Korea, today 140th South Korea. That is the question you are going to have to come up with a policy response to, and it cannot be driven by impulses, emotions, and photographs, however sad.
Thank you very much. Okay. Our next question will start here, sir.
So my question is directed mostly towards Ms. May. You've made criticisms regarding Iraq and Libya. And in relation to that, Iraq, we know, was a hard intervention. Libya was a soft intervention. And in Syria, there was no intervention. And the case that has the highest mortality rate is Syria. Given that, do you not think, perhaps think we should reconsider Western inaction, given that has contributed to both the high mortality rate there and the exacerbation of this exact issue we're discussing today?
Okay, the second question, we'll go here, sir.
My name is Usama El Muhtar. I'm a Syrian Canadian who arrived in this country 40 years ago. I have 4 children, 3 are university graduates and 1 is a college graduate. And I'm very proud of them and proud of this country that welcomed us after the war in Lebanon in 1975. There were many misconceptions that I heard tonight. I've written 4 books on the Middle East, and I have traveled Syria and Lebanon over the last 10 years extensively. One of the first misconceptions about education, Syria had established the first virtual university in 2004, the first university of its kind in the Middle East, graduating with double accreditation, one from Syria, one from a Western university at the same time. Second misconception, the Syrian army is mostly Sunni Muslims, and it's still intact, and it's still defending the Syrian state. My question now is this. Ms. May mentioned very briefly that the war in Iraq, the invasion, illegal, I should stress, invasion of Iraq by the Bush administration caused refugees flowing into Syria, and I know for a fact it was a contributing factor to the war in Syria. To stop such events from ever happening again, should those who illegally go and invade countries thinking they can escape the responsibility or consequence, should they be brought to justice as a step to stopping such wars from ever happening again? Thank you.
Thank you. And third questioner, sir, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you both for coming today. My question is more for Ms. May, but also just partly apply to Mr. Frum. I think in part of your discussion, you're conflating immigration with refugees coming into the country. Obviously, I think the debate here and in general, they have to be separated out. And my question has to do with, apart from anecdotal evidence of this person and that person on either side, do you have any statistical data or evidence to support that the overall economic benefit to Canada has been greater from having refugees than the cost to Canadian society economically? Obviously, in the current situation, there's not going to be data in terms of Syrian refugees, but in terms of past populations that have come here, whether from Somalia or, as you mentioned, Vietnam, whether they've had a net economic benefit on the country. Thanks.
Okay. Concludes our questions for this session. Ms. May, the floor is yours. 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the last one just because it's fresh in my mind. Within a decade of arrival, the Vietnamese boat people had an unemployment rate 2.3 percentage point lower than Canada as a whole. They were very entrepreneurial, relied less heavily on social assistance than the general population. So you might just say, well, those were the Vietnamese boat people, but when you look at stats on migration from Lebanon as a result of the civil war in the 60s and 70s, the class of refugees who came to Canada from Lebanon created, on average, close to 3 jobs per refugee who came to Canada. So we do have good economic data that refugee populations are not distinct from immigration in general in bringing more economic activity, creating jobs, seeking education in Canada, contributing to our country. For the first question, this notion of hard involvement, no involvement, I think I was clear in my opening that I do think that the world owed an effort under responsibility to protect Syrian civilians from their own government. But the damage done by the illegal war in Iraq is monumental in terms of destabilizing the region, the refugee flows, and then directly related to the creation of ISIS was the decision after the war in Iraq, and I know with 3 minutes I can't do justice to some very complex historical realities, but the decision for all kinds of reasons to say that anyone who is part of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist party could not hold a job in Iraq, created a ready pool of very efficient managers and generals who needed work, and they found work with the horrific death cult ISIS. So there are quite a few people looking at that situation and saying, again, in terms of unintended consequences, rather more damage was done. So can we hold people responsible who conduct illegal wars in other countries? We can, if those countries subscribe to the International Criminal Court, which is one reason, and I see in the front row one of my heroes of negotiating the International Criminal Court, our former ambassador to the United Nations, Paul Heinbecker. Thank you for negotiating that, and I do remember the White House wasn't pleased. Thank you.
Mr. Frum, the floor is yours, sir.
Yes, the question of the economic effect of immigration is an extremely complicated one, and one in which generalizations are dangerous. Here's a way I think about it, and why you get one kind of result when you look at the Vietnamese boat people, when you look at the refugees from Lebanon in the 1970s, when you look at other such populations. Since World War II, what we, for lack of a better term, call the Third World, has been swept by a series of revolutions that overturned old imperial structures. When those countries were ruled by empires, European empires, other empires, there arose, under the protection of those empires, what the sociologist Amy Chua calls market-dominant minorities that were typically not part of the majority, like the Chinese in Indonesia. That was Amy Chua's background, and these people would occupy crucial places in the local economy, Lebanese in East Africa. When these countries would go through their popular revolutions, the first step was to drive the market-dominant minorities out. Jews, of course, are the most complete example of a market-dominant minority. Unsurprisingly, when these groups arrive in the West or in more developed countries, they succeed brilliantly. That it is dangerous to generalize from their success to how other people from that society, the non-market populations, in what are rural and peasant societies, how they're going to perform when they arrive in the West. You cannot look at what happens when the Lebanese merchants arrive and generalize that to the whole Syrian population, unfortunately. If it were true, then Syria would not have been such a mess before the Civil War. One of the questions we need to ask is if these populations are so economically ready, why were their countries so economically unsuccessful beforehand? So I think I did a lot of work on this for an article I wrote about the Atlantic. The data is there. But what is fair to say is Middle Eastern and North African immigrants to Europe have, just about everywhere where there's been a calculation, have been a net fiscal drain. They cost more in benefits than they contribute in taxes. And now, those are very generous states, and these are people who don't earn a lot. Economically, what I worry about is less the fiscal effect than the economic effect. What do they contribute to the overall wealth of the society? And the verdict there is very damaging. All through Europe, we see Middle Eastern and North African populations participate in the labor force at levels dramatically lower than non-Middle East, non-North African populations, both native-born and immigrants from other regions. And we're going to have that same problem, I think, in North America with large-scale mass migration from the Middle East. Intervention in Syria, I was not in favor of it. I think I was in favor of the war in Iraq, but when you intervene, you have to have something you are for as well as what you are against. There was no one in Syria who we were in favor of. So all we would do is end up in the role of umpires being shot at by all sides. I didn't see the possibility of a successful intervention in the Syrian war. It would have ended up like Libya, which is you smash up what passes for order in the place, and you have nothing to offer in a replacement. I may say one last thing, because I think that third question, which I don't want to neglect, because I think it was very much directed at me.
Well, you'll have your 5 minutes.
What?
You'll have your 5 minutes.
Well, all right. But I think people want to hear the answer to that one. I think right. I won't take long.
All right.
I said at the very beginning of the debate that the question of why, despite the incredible population growth of the Middle East, its economy had not kept up, unlike China, unlike India, unlike other parts of the world. And I said that was a complicated question. I wasn't going to deal with it, and I don't think I can do justice to it. But one of the things we can point to is, in the entire Arabic world, population of 250 million people, there are fewer books every year translated from other languages into Arabic than are translated into Greek, a language spoken by 14 million people. And one of the things that has been a problem in that part of the world is a determination to believe that all problems are caused by outsiders, Jews, Americans, the British, somebody else. Never, the look is never inward, it is always outward. And that breeds both a culture of conspiracy thinking, and it also breeds a culture of passivity. And that is the reason why this is a region that has not only been so plunged into violence itself, but an exporter of violence to so many other people who would rather not be touched by it. The war in Iraq, whether you like it or not like it, was not some whim of the United States. It was a response. Right, wrong, smart, stupid, it was a response to the Middle East export of violence to the rest of the planet over the past third of a century. Actually now longer than that. And I think there needs to be, along with your accusations, some self-examination of what went wrong, and that in that part of the world, and that is maybe the most fundamental question of all when we are confronted by this now mass migration from that part of the world to the West.
Okay. Well, thank you. That concludes the time for questions, unfortunately, but we did expect 9, and the time got taken up with them, so we did it. I'm now pleased to call on Ms. May for her final remarks, the concluding statement, 5 minutes. Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm glad that David Frum suggested that the Iraq War calls for self-examination. I think that leaves Canadians off the hook. We in Canada, I think, remain very pleased that our government of the day refused to participate in an illegal war in Iraq, and a great deal of the tragedy that besets the region today was due to that mistake. Look, I'm wanting to make sure that I cover some bases here. Do we have good empirical evidence that immigration and refugees generally help our economy? I've found quite a lot of studies in preparing for tonight's discussion, and they are very impressive. But one that was particularly relevant for me as a British Columbia Member of Parliament was put together by the Van City Credit Union in British Columbia, but they hired some economists to look through it. And if you want to find it online so you can go look up the stats, it's called From Crisis to Community, Syrian Refugees and the BC Economy. In other words, we are looking forward to embracing more Syrian refugees coming to British Columbia, the numbers of groups who have stepped up, the numbers of mayors, including the closest large city to my riding, the city of Victoria, and Mayor Lisa Helps. People are offering to welcome Syrian refugees, partly because of the economic opportunity, and partly because I think we all see the need to counteract the general fear factor that could result in a rejection of Muslim immigrants in a way that is deeply disturbing and in fact racist. And to hear it from anybody anywhere in the world, no Muslim immigration, is deeply worrying and should worry all of us, because we are in this world absolutely desperately in need of respectful dialogue, of welcoming neighbors wherever they are from whatever part of the world, and we are in a very real sense in a global neighborhood, in a global village, and creating Islamophobia is not going to help. So now that I know from Mr. Frum that he's less worried about whether people are going to be terrorists when we sit down to interview them, and more worried about whether their children not yet born are going to turn out to be juvenile delinquents, I realize I have a real unanswerable challenge to figure out how do we protect ourselves from the yet to be born potential juvenile delinquent, and he's also suggested to us that this is predictable delinquency. So now that I'm thinking about it, I am getting worried. There may be people who seem to have very racist ideas, very homophobic ideas, who actually celebrate punching out their fellow citizens. I suggest that we put all the Trump voters down for a serious conversation about how they plan to raise their children. Now, and I said, but not to make light of it, it is a challenge how people integrate into a society. All of us in this room who are not First Nations, Métis, or Inuit are immigrants to this country, one way or the other, over how many generations. I think we can begin to guess. Some of us recent, some of us longer. But the thing that makes Canada the kind of country that continues to attract people who want to live here is that we have done something that other countries have failed to do. And that's in being a place that actually says we will welcome people who come here with the clothes on their back. We will have faith in their ability to participate. We will see their children educated alongside our children and get their university degrees and contribute to our society, and know that this is a country that offers something that very few are successful in doing. A country that isn't just tolerant, because that suggests putting up with something you don't like much, but we're a society that loves to see the diversity of cultures, that recognize it contributes to our resilience as a country, to our wealth, to our prosperity, and to making us the kind of country that continues to have people around the world say, I want some of what they're having. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Frum, the floor is yours, sir. 5 minutes remarks.
I have some very disillusioning news for Elizabeth May. The present Deputy Minister of Veterans Affairs was served in 2004-05 as the Deputy Commander of the multinational force in Iraq. I met, when I visited Iraq a couple times, and met dozens of Canadians. They were not serving in combat roles, but they were training Iraqi forces in positions often of great danger, and they served with great distinction. Canada was in Iraq, and it served bravely and well, and I think that is something that is to Canada's credit, and you may not think so, but it certainly did happen. It was a fact. So Canada was not a fighting partner in Iraq, but it was a partner. I think I do believe that despite, we've had some brushes and some exchanges back and forth, I do believe that we did actually see tonight more consensus and agreement than disagreement. I think we saw a consensus that we're not going to bring very large numbers of Syrians to Canada. Elizabeth May likes the number 35,000. And that, to my mind, that may be somewhat on the high side, but spread over in sufficient period of time and with sufficient background checking. And if you're looking for the right people, and particularly if you're emphasizing people from communities that are in most danger and are most likely to acculturate successfully to Canada, especially Yazidis and Christians, I think that it's certainly not outside the realm of the conceivable, but it's nobody's idea of mass resettlement. Mass resettlement, when you're dealing with a population of 12 million people, is denominated in the millions. Like what Germany has done by taking in 1.3 million people, about half of them probably from Syria, half of them showing up with other documents. That is what mass resettlement looks like. And what you're seeing in Germany is the consequence of mass resettlement. What France experienced with the people who left after the Algerian Civil War, they took in some hundreds of thousands of people. That is what mass resettlement looks like, and it has consequences. That is what I think we both, Elizabeth May tacitly and me explicitly, I think we both agree. That's not a good idea. And Elizabeth may want to have some more complimentary statements about the reasons for her position, but the position isn't that different. The solution to the problem of this mass refugee crisis and the one that's coming next and the one that's coming after that must be found in the region. And it is a solution that is based on development. It is a solution that is based on bringing population and economic growth more closely into line. It is a solution that is based on modernizing the culture of the people in the region, in the place where they live. But it is not a solution that is based on the idea that we all agree, it seems to me, is impossible. Mass resettlement of large numbers of displaced Syrians in Canada, the Western world. You don't want it. You're not a proponent of it. I don't think it's a good idea. And I think by the time we're done, probably everybody in the House will agree with the two of us that this should not be done. But that is not a no. That is a yes. That is a yes to responsible solutions. That is a yes to electricity. That's a yes to water treatment. That's a yes to education. That's a yes to job training. That is a yes to spending 1/12 the price per person to find a solution to the refugee crisis in the place where, of course, the refugees are going to have to stay. And I thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank our two debaters for their excellent presentations and the vigorous debate we've enjoyed tonight. And I thank those in the audience who put questions forward. I think it was great and it was a nice discussion. So the question before you now is, and I'll put the motion as a resolution: mass resettlement to Canada is the best thing for the country and the best thing for Syrian refugees. All those who agree? And those who disagree? Ah, things have changed. Okay. And those who have no view or haven't decided? Similar. Okay. Well, thank you, and appreciate your interest in the debate, and I'm sure that we'll hear now from the chair of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Brian, the floor is yours, and thank you very much. All went smoothly.
Thank you very much, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, gosh, my time's up and I've only just arrived.
Oh, sorry, I left that.
I'm going to take a few extra minutes. I don't care what his iPhone says. Ladies and gentlemen, I have presided, or I have watched Peter preside over many of these debates. I just think this was one of the finest examples of the exercise of intelligence and passion in the pursuit of the answers to difficult public policy questions that I have ever seen. I, of course, want to thank our two debaters, as Peter Milliken has already done, but nobody has yet thanked Peter. So please join me. I'd like to mention once again those who helped to make this evening possible. Thanks to CPAC for taping and airing these debates online. I've already mentioned the times. Yep. The times that you'll be able to watch this, please tell your friends, tweet about it. Thanks to our volunteers, Brendan McLaughlin, Kevin Turnbull, Cassini Maharan, Stephanie Cooper for all your hard work. Thanks to the MLI staff, David Watson, Joanna Roach, Colin Cook, Sabina Syed, and Mark Brownlee. And lastly, thanks to all of you who bought the tickets in spite of the no-buy list. And thanks to those who sponsored the Great Canadian Debate. We very much appreciate your support. And finally, may I please take a moment and remind you that this event was organized by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. That's Macdonald, that's Laurier. They inspired us to think that Canada had a great political tradition that transcended party politics, and that it was the job of somebody to bring that great political tradition to Canadians, and that's the job we set for ourselves. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all at our next and final debate for this season, which will be on May 31st, again here in the War Museum. It's a debate on whether or not the Supreme Court is intruding on the rights and privileges of Parliament, and our debaters on that occasion will be former Justice Minister Irwin Cotler and the founder of the National Post, Conrad Black.
Go, Irwin!
Don't miss it. Merci et bonne fin de soirée.